Our second lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A friend of mine recently encouraged me to read an article that recommends taking a 2-minute long icy cold shower every morning. I know, it sounds miserable. But apparently there are all kinds of physical and emotional benefits to this practice. But this isn't why the author recommends it. The author claims that when you do something like taking a cold shower first thing in the morning, then later in the day when you face other difficult tasks, it makes them easier to tackle. The man in the crowd who asks Jesus to divide the family inheritance for him does not seem accustomed to doing the hard thing. He wants Jesus to do it for him. "Jesus, can't you talk to my brother and make him give me some of the money our parents left him?" Jesus does not take the bait, but he does tell a story about a farmer. This farmer had a good year in a notoriously unpredictable profession. He worked his land, and the land produced abundantly. It is what every hardworking farmer hopes for and rarely gets: an abundant harvest, unblemished, as so many recent harvests around the world have been, by drought or a late freeze or a mysterious blight. Farming has never been an easy or a predictable way of earning a living. And when the land produces an abundant harvest, it is cause for rejoicing. This farmer looks around at all this abundance and tries to figure out what to do with it. If he builds bigger barns to store that abundance for a year when things don't go well, is that so wrong? Jesus calls him a fool, but if we're honest, to us, he seems sensible. After all, we may not build barns, but we have our 401ks and our IRAs and our 529s. Is this not the way we seek to use the resources God has given us to plan wisely for the future? But if we look at the context of this story, there is no escaping the point Jesus is making. All we have to do is look back at the way he introduces this parable. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. When the farmer is trying to figure out what to do with his windfall, listen again to what he says. "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. My. This man's flaw is not that he is rich, it is that he is thinking of no one but himself. That's why he's a fool. The decision to keep his surplus to himself not only makes him foolish, it violates multiple laws of the Old Testament. In a time when one's wealth was measured by the production of one's land, God commanded the Israelites to set aside 1/10 of the harvest for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Certainly, the farmer in this story could have obeyed these laws and still had plenty left over for himself. But he has no respect for God's laws or for those around him in need, in spite of the fact that no matter the profession, no one makes a fortune without help from others. But all this man can think of is I. Arthur Brooks is the president of the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank that seeks to strengthen free enterprise. While getting his PhD in economics, Brooks became convinced that capitalism is the one economic system that can truly move poor people out of poverty. But as he taught undergraduates and went around the country lecturing at universities, he discovered that most young people today want nothing to do with what they see as a corrupt system which elevates success and materialism over everything else, and which perpetuates a huge and growing divide between the rich and the poor. Around this time, Brooks went on a business trip to India. After talking to a colleague about his confusion over the way his students view capitalism, the colleague suggested he visit a certain Hindu religious teacher. When Brooks went to the monastery and met the teacher, he was shocked to discover that the teacher was a 30-year-old from Texas. He was born in Texas to immigrant parents from India, and he did everything his parents encouraged him to do. He studied hard, graduated at the top of his high school class, went to college, studied finance and business, and then went to work for an investment bank. In just a few years, he was earning more than his father had in a lifetime of work. He was also miserable. So after doing this for some years, he finally sold his big house and his fancy car, gave his money to charity, and moved to a monastery in India. This is what he told Arthur Brooks when they met. The problem with capitalism isn't money. The problem is that people become emotionally attached to their stuff. A colleague of mine puts it this way: everything you own owns a piece of you. The house that constantly needs maintenance, updates, or repair, the car that needs gas or an oil change or new tires, the jewelry that we worry could get lost or stolen. None of these things are inherently bad. And this is not a passage about selling all your stuff, although there are people for whom Jesus recommends this. What this passage highlights is how easily things can get in the way of our relationships with people. As Arthur Brooks puts it, every day we are bombarded with the message to love things and use people, when true happiness comes from using things and loving people. Fools store up treasure for themselves but are not rich towards God, Jesus says. Being rich towards God is not about sacrificing all our resources to God alone, but to God's children in need. Jesus is telling us that our stuff doesn't matter. People do. We know this. And yet, we are bombarded every day with advertisements that claim that happiness comes when we buy whatever it is they are selling. Interestingly, one of the most successful contemporary advertising campaigns suggests the opposite. You know these ads. They go something like this: baseball glove to catch the fly ball, $20. Gas to drive to the stadium, $40. 2 tickets to the home game, $150. Taking your son to his first Major League Baseball game. If you go back and look at these ads, and you can see many of them on YouTube, you will find that nearly everything in the category of priceless involves experiences that people have together. Experiences, in other words, that foster relationships. And at the end of each of these commercials, we are reminded that there are some things that money can't buy. The something that money can't buy is the very thing the farmer in this parable doesn't have. Relationships that are created and nurtured through experiences. And it is this, more than his hoarding of his resources, that makes him such a fool. He may have abundant crops, he may have the biggest barn on the block, but he has no one in his life to share it with, no one to enjoy it with, no one who can even use it when he's dead and gone. He has decided that he needs no one, and that is why when his life is over, God calls him a fool. He has foolishly misjudged what really matters. Which is the point of this story. Remember what prompted Jesus to tell it? The man who asked Jesus to get his brother to divide up the family inheritance with him is asking Jesus to do it because he doesn't want to tackle the difficult task of talking to his brother about why he wants and thinks he deserves some of that inheritance. He is avoiding the challenges of relationships. And who can blame him? Relationships are hard. Loving people is hard. Sharing is hard. For all of the wonderful experiences we have that bolster our relationships, meaningful relationships require many difficult experiences as well. I'm sure I'm not the only one whose head is still spinning from the rhetoric of the 2 conventions over the past weeks. From one, we heard a message of fear and mistrust, that the world is inherently dangerous and we should be very afraid, especially of anyone who looks or acts or believes or prays differently than we do. From the other, we heard that love is going to solve all of our problems. Love trumps hate, and if we just work together, everything we're worried about will be fine. Both of these assessments contain truth and falsehood because there is nothing easy about loving people, especially people who are different from us. If you have spent any time in any church, then you have certainly learned this. Because while churches may be made up of people who believe in the God of love and mercy, churches, just like our families, are communities where we have to deal with people who disagree with us, people who annoy us, and sometimes even people who have hurt us. Like families, church relationships are incredibly hard, requiring humility and forgiveness and the willingness to admit when we are wrong. And yet, in the book of Genesis, when God creates the world and everything in it, God pronounces one thing after another good. The light and the dark, the sea and the land, the creation of mammals and birds and human beings. In that whole story, the only time we hear that something is not good is when God looks at Adam and says, "It is not good that man should be alone." God has created us for relationships, which is why God goes to such lengths to be in relationship with us. God has created us to live in communities built on meaningful relationships, which can only be forged through experiences of love and forgiveness and sacrifice. When Ronnie Kitchen was released from prison after serving 21 years, his mother did not recognize him. That wasn't because of how much he changed physically in his decades behind bars. It was because during that time, Ronnie's mother began to suffer from dementia. When he sat with her, he asked her why she was staring at him, and she said, "I'm trying to figure out who you are." He went into the bathroom so she wouldn't see him crying. When he came out, she said, "Guess what? My baby is coming home." "Who are you talking about?" he asked. And she answered, "Ronnie." The worst part of this story is that Ronnie was released from prison after 21 years, not because he had served his full sentence, but because he was finally proven innocent of the murders for which he was convicted. Ronnie then sued the city of Chicago, which meant he had to try to put a price tag on what he had lost. When his lawyers asked him how much he wanted to sue for, he basically pulled a number out of thin air. He ended up settling for about 10% of that, which was still enough to buy a nice house and car and to start his own business. But was all that enough to make up for what he suffered? Someone asked Ronnie that recently, and he laughed bitterly. $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion, they asked. Would that be enough? Not enough, he said. You can't give me my mother back. You can't give me my mother. Jesus teaches us again and again in word and in deed that our stuff doesn't matter. There is not one material thing we have, either as individuals or as a church, that makes us who we are. Our stuff doesn't matter. What matters is God's children around us and the degree to which we are willing to invest in them. Stuff doesn't matter. People do. Jesus looks at every single one of us and says, "You are incredibly, unbelievably rich. Don't be a fool." Amen.